To start, and we are very happy having a very special guest with us who will be introduced by and hosted by Wolfgang Geismeier.
Yeah, thank you very much all for being here. It's really my pleasure to introduce to you Tim Johnson from Willamette University in Portland, where he's a professor for public management and policy analysis. So he's actually a political scientist who got his PhD from Stanford University like a couple of years back, actually. And Tim and I have met in 2004 when we were both at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. I was a grad student there and he was a visiting student from Stanford University, and he was this brilliant young guy already back then. I mean, his hair was longer, my hair was also fuller at that time and less gray, so things have changed, but his brilliance, I think, hasn't changed. And the topics that he has studied, so why do we invite a political scientist to this cluster and not to the other? He may also give a talk actually to the other cluster, but lots of his research has actually focused on cooperation and prisoners' dilemmas, which are, I think, very relevant to us. And he has published on these topics in Nature, in PNAS, and so forth. So I think he does have to say a lot that is extremely relevant to us. And Tim, I'm really looking forward to this talk with a crazy title about prime numbers and what they actually have to do with the evolution of cooperation. And as I also, before giving you, he asked me to keep it short because he has many slides that he wants to show to you. But yeah, Tim will be around all week and would really be happy to meet people from all kinds of disciplines. So please drop me a note if you're interested in meeting Tim. And also we will have dinner tonight at 6:45 at Six Senses, and we still have a couple of spaces left. So please let me know if you're interested in having dinner with us tonight. And with that, without much further ado, I give it to you, Tim. And you have a separate microphone.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Thanks so much. Very much. Thanks for that generous introduction, and thanks to all of you for allowing me to share some of my recent work with you. In some ways, this is going to be a peculiar talk in the sense that I'm going to start out by presenting a very abstract model that likely has limited empirical implications, and in fact, in some ways, takes an unusual approach to evolutionary game theory in order to identify how the prisoner's dilemma is related to the prime numbers. And then after that, I'm going to introduce a computational model that does offer some empirical predictions. But in the last part of the talk, I'm going to present some preliminary evidence that I've gathered that suggests that the empirical predictions don't bear out in actual data. And so in some ways, this talk is going to provide some insight about how the world doesn't work as opposed to how it does. But I think that's going to provide a direction to think about where we can go with this topic into the future. And so there might be some value nonetheless in it. And it'll wrap up with a presentation of this model that is running on this slide here. This is a spatial prisoner's dilemma model that I'm going to talk about briefly at the end of this session. In this spatial prisoner's dilemma model, I've located cooperators at the prime numbered locations of Ulam's spiral. Ulam's spiral is this right-angled swirl of the positive integers, and when you mark out the prime numbers on it, you see this interesting pattern where the primes appear on diagonals and in this crosshatched pattern. And it gives us a degree of insight into their distribution. And this model I'll show at the end of the talk, perhaps has some relevance to understanding unique features of that spiral. And so it implies a direction that could be taken with this work, probably by somebody far more technically sophisticated than me, to use computational methods and evolutionary game theory models in order to understand some of the numerical properties of the primes and perhaps other forms of numerical exploration. But before I get to that model, the goal here is going to be to present a series of other models that will show a connection to a rather obscure literature that uses models of natural phenomena, where folks from across disciplines write out models of natural processes that nonetheless identify the prime numbers. And so there's been work across fields that show that a physical system's energy levels, for instance, can identify the prime numbers, that molecular aggregation can identify the prime numbers, and that perhaps most famously, hybridization and predator-prey dynamics can identify the prime numbers. There's cicada that have prime numbered life cycles, as is widely known, and there's been work to model those life cycles that shows that predator-prey dynamics can identify the prime numbers, basically show a way of detecting and distinguishing prime numbers from composite numbers, and in so doing, creating this interesting connection between the natural world and how we model it and these numerical phenomenon. And in this work on predator-prey dynamics, a team that wrote a classic paper in this literature, Eric Goles, Oliver Schultz, and Mario Marcus, back in 2001, they make this bold forecast, which is really neat, where they say, hey, look, we've used this modeling framework that is part of a broader literature, part of a broader technical apparatus, and we expect this predator-prey model that we've produced to be connected to these other models in this literature, of which one is the prisoner's dilemma. And in today's talk, what I'll do is I'll show that this bold forecast is right. There is a way of writing out a prisoner's dilemma model that can identify the prime numbers. And that's the work that I've pursued in recent months that I'll be presenting today, and that hopefully some of you have seen the papers that were circulated in which this work was published. Now, to make sure that we're on the same page before I start diving into the aspect of this work that deals with the prime numbers, I just want to make sure that we're all clear about how we'll depict the prisoner's dilemma, what variant of the prisoner's dilemma's specification we'll be discussing in today's talk. I'm going to focus on the dyadic prisoner's dilemma, so you can imagine entities that can adopt a strategy either to cooperate or defect. Cooperators incur some cost in order to produce a benefit that another cooperator will enjoy if they happen to meet up, but that, of course, a defector can free ride upon and abscond with that benefit, leaving the cooperator just with the costs, and creating a scenario where if the defector bumps into another defector, they end up not socially interacting. The shirking of the defector yields no payoff, and that's true of the other defector as well. And so as a result, we've got this dilemma whereby what's socially beneficial and maximizes social welfare is mutual cooperation, but the incentives to defect and free ride upon one's colleague yield an asocial state where nothing happens, no payoffs are obtained. This is the one-shot prisoner's dilemma that's going to serve as the basis for the work that I discuss in the next handful of minutes. And when we embed this model in an evolutionary process, studying it across generations, you see that, of course, the defectors playing a one-shot game are going to do quite well. Imagine a population where 3/4 of it consists of cooperators and 1/4 of it consists of defectors. In that environment, some of the cooperators are inevitably going to be paired with a defector. And as a result, they'll suffer exploitation. Defectors will gain the benefits from free riding, and this will, over time, lead to a state where the payoffs of defectors are higher than the cooperators, and an evolutionary process such as, say, replicator dynamics is going to, if we treat those payoffs as proportional to fitness, it's going to lead the population towards a state of mutual defection. The free riders will take over. And this is all kind of like basic stuff, but just to make sure we're on the same page here. And of course, if a cooperator mutant appears, it'll be repelled from invading because defectors will exploit it, and the population will revert back to a state of mutual defection. And even if two mutants simultaneously appear, jointly attempt an invasion, they might grow their share of the population briefly because they're doing better from defectors in the off chance that they meet each other and not any of those defectors. But that's going to be short-lived, and all of a sudden we're going to have a state where the defectors return once again. So this is the prisoner's dilemma model embedded in an evolutionary process, and it seems hopeless. It seems very hopeless. But of course we know that there's many mechanisms that can support cooperation. And given the time constraint today, I won't dive into this literature, but I will just simply say I'm going to contribute to only one portion of it. You can break down all of these compelling mechanisms that have been studied in the existing literature into two camps that are based upon varying degrees of cognition that the mechanism entails. When you think about something like reciprocity, it requires some memory process. You have to be able to track the behavior of others to some limited degree at least. That's not true, perhaps, of, say, kin altruism due to dispersal patterns or network structure. These are processes that a naive agent with limited cognition can nonetheless engage in activities that yield stronger rates of cooperation, just through naive cooperation. And that's the line of literature that I'll contribute to today. What I'll depict is a process that requires very limited cognition at all, and that has to do with cooperators who assort themselves into unique camps that allow them to differentially find other cooperators. That's the mechanism effectively under study as an assortment process, and so it falls into this camp of models that require limited cognition of the agents. And the basis for the mechanism is time, or at least that's the substantive format that I think makes the model most comprehensible. As we can think about the prisoner's dilemma in this one-shot variant as being a model that assumes that all action within a generation, intragenerationally, is taking place at one point in time. But if we add another time point to the one-shot prisoner's dilemma, all of a sudden the viability of cooperation becomes more apparent. Not so much that it's going to evolve the fixation and take over the population, but that it at least has a chance to get its foot in the door. So we dispense with the one-shot prisoner's dilemma that assumes one time point, and we all of a sudden assume a second time point, and the range of strategies that we consider all of a sudden expands. We've got folks who can cooperate at time point 1 or defect at time point 1, two strategies that are now available. That turns into a one-shot interaction at time point 1. But at this other discrete time point, we've got cooperators that can show up and engage with other cooperators or engage with defectors at time point 2. So another set of strategies that are available. And this yields a one-shot prisoner's dilemma at this second time point. Now, of course, if an agent shows up at time point 1, but the other agent shows up at time point 2, no social interaction occurs. And so we have an outcome that's similar to mutual defection, a state of non-social activity, where there's no cooperation, there's no benefits or costs that are exchanged in the process. This is an expanded model that now considers two time points, and again, this is going to be the foundation for the later models that will explore the prime numbers and their relation to the prisoner's dilemma. In this model, all of a sudden, the viability of cooperation becomes more apparent. When we look at this population that we initially studied, and we recognize that it's apt to move towards a state of mutual defection, this no longer appears as hopeless if a mutant cooperator appears at the second time period. Now all of a sudden, we have the same payoff for the cooperator that happens to show up at midnight when the rest of the community shows up at noon. It's no longer going to be exploited. This would allow a drift process, for instance, to move the population towards a state of mutual cooperation. Briefly before a defector shows up, which I'll get to in a second here. Or you could have an invasion of two mutants or more that allows for this process to move a little bit faster because the cooperators are going to land the benefits less the costs of cooperation, whereas those defectors in this initial time state will be in a state of non-social interaction or nothing. And so the population will drive towards more cooperation, but of course that's going to be vulnerable to a defector mutant appearing, exploiting the cooperators. That time point, moving the population towards more defection, and then as we follow this process, the mutations that can occur at the opposing time point, at the one where there's a productive opportunity for cooperators, they're going to shift the population back and forth. So a dismal state of defection at one time point allows for cooperator mutants to appear at the next time point, but then those cooperator mutants are going to bump into a defector that exploits them, driving the population to defection, making that time period unproductive, and this oscillation will continue on and on and on. We could explore it for as many generations as possible, and what we would find as we start to zoom out here in a moment on this evolutionary trajectory is we would find an oscillating pattern where the population moves back and forth between the two time periods due to the unproductivity that arrives from defectors taking over the population at some time point. And so this is in some ways, this is kind of like a more hopeful story than the one-shot prisoner's dilemma. It suggests that there's this like challenge of good versus evil that goes on, and ultimately it will persist in perpetuity so long as mutant cooperators appear at that opposing time point where the defectors aren't already the incumbent. This can be generalized to any number of discrete time points, this model, and it provides the foundation for a prisoner's dilemma model that can identify the prime numbers. Now, I'll say at the outset, a very abstract and unusual model that can identify the prime numbers. And the way it does so is by enriching this initial model of the one-shot prisoner's dilemma played at multiple time points so that it takes into account, I would argue, like features of reality that are somewhat more plausible. They'll still be very abstract, but somewhat more plausible than this model here. What it basically will show in this model is that if you start to add forms of cyclical activity, agents that have periods of activity and inactivity, or what some might call temporal partitioning, you go to bed at night, you wake up, you go to bed at night, you wake up, you're dividing your time between periods of activity and inactivity. When we add that to the model, it's going to enhance the plausibility of it, but it's also going to lead to a prime number identifier. And so the way I'll demonstrate that in these slides to make sure that it's all intuitive is you can imagine in this initial model, an agent plays at one time period. Now we'll have the opportunity for that agent to play at another time period using a schedule that has some periodic behavior. There's a period length that the agent will abide by. And just to kind of briefly describe the notation here, the parameter tau will be used to set that period length, and the period length will determine the time points in a discrete set of time points that the agent is active in. And so the agent will be active here in every other time point, every second time point, and then it'll basically like take a nap in between time points. We can consider other periodic schedules, such as one that uses period length 3, so plays in every third time point of a generation. And then we could imagine greater valued period lengths such that those are large enough values that given the set of discrete time points that are available in which to play, an agent is only able to operate in be active in one time point of a generation. So here that would be, for instance, agents that would play in a schedule that uses period lengths 4 and 5. These are now the more complex strategies that will be available in this new model that I'll be describing. And we can also have then, in this model, the concatenation of these periodic schedules such that the sets of time points at which strategies would play is formed together, is concatenated, is brought together in the union of those sets, and then agents can play over larger spans of time. So this is the other type of temporal activity that folks can engage in this model. They can fuse together different time points in order to play in an expanded range of the periods within a generation. And at those periods in the generation, they'll implement their social behavior in the prisoner's dilemma. Pardon me. And so that and that'll be constrained by having an initial empty time point. Perhaps something not realistic, but we'll see in this relatively contrived model to identify the prisoner's dilemmas, to identify prime numbers using the prisoner's dilemma, that's necessary. Okay. The other feature of the model that we'll add to make it more plausible is we're going to allow for the payoff to non-interaction not to be 0, but to be some parameter k, which you can think of as, say, individual foraging. Whereas in that initial model that I showed, folks don't socially interact with each other, and as a result, nothing happens. In this model, we'll assume that folks who show up at midnight when their friends had scheduled a meeting at noon, they can nonetheless individually forage, so to speak, and earn a payoff k, a no-play payoff, so to speak. And so a strategy that, say, concatenates these period lengths and is active from time points 2 to time point 6 would acquire 5 times k as its payoff if it didn't socially interact with any other party. If it did, it would also join those payoffs with the prisoner's dilemma payoffs, and we'll assume that the benefits from mutual cooperation, actually engaging in social interaction, are greater than anything that can be gained from individual foraging. And I think this is, even though this is, again, like part of a very abstract model that might be regarded as contrived, it nonetheless actually has some empirical plausibility in the sense that, why would you engage in a social interaction if you could do better by individual foraging? You wouldn't, and so you would assume that the only reason we would ever see that type of social activity would be if it somehow brought greater benefits, and that's what this assumption effectively implies. So, okay. So that's the foundation of this model, enriching that initial model that we studied briefly at the outset of this talk. And we'll analyze this model in a particular way in order to reveal the prime numbers. We'll start out with the fewest number of time points that are possible for the model to make sense, 2 time points. And in this setting, we'll examine whether or not there's an evolutionary stable strategy or a neutrally stable strategy. We can immediately note that this is a one-shot prisoner's dilemma game augmented by the payoff K. And so defectors are invariably going to take over the population and resist a cooperator invasion. That makes them an evolutionary stable strategy when we have the time points set to 2 in the model. We then will take the number of time points and increment it by 1 in this form of analysis that reveals the prime numbers, and regard the defectors as the incumbent when we analyze this model with an additional time point added to those that are available for agents to play in. In that situation, we've got now the defectors that are at time point 2. We'll examine whether or not cooperators can invade in this new model now that emerges once we have an additional time point. And what we see is a more complex payoff matrix, but we can quickly examine it and note that cooperators are going to get the same payoff as the incumbent population of defectors playing a schedule with period length 2, thus allowing those cooperators to invade, or in the event of 2 cooperators appearing simultaneously, I should say invade by drift, or if 2 cooperators appear simultaneously, they'll get higher payoffs than the defectors in the incumbent population who are playing at time point 2, and thus they'll be able to expand their share of the population. And we could consider it a full invasion of the cooperators. Of course, it's just like in that initial model, not a state that's going to persist for long, because when we examine this invasion, we're going to note that it'll be halted at some point. So the invasion can begin, cooperators can grow their share of the population, but it can't persist in perpetuity because there's a defector strategy that we'll note is evolutionarily stable. So we'll return to step 2, assess what's the ESS in this model that has an expanded number of time points, and we'll note that a strategy that plays with a period length of both 2 and 3 that concatenates those period lengths in its schedule is going to be able to take over those cooperators that have grown their share of the population, and thus the model will see, there's the payoffs right here. Thus the model will revert to a state of mutual defection, and that will be the evolutionary stable state. We now go through this process repeatedly, and the prime numbers start to be revealed through cooperator invasions. Whenever we have a situation where 2 or more cooperators can invade at the new time point by playing a schedule with a period length that equals that time point's value, we're going to see a cooperator invasion at the prime numbers, and that will reveal the prime numbers. And so we've got now time point 4, cooperators can't invade. The reason why: defectors are playing a schedule in the incumbent population that shares a common multiple with this new cooperator mutant that has a period length that's equal to the value of the new time period. So population reverts to the state of mutual defection. Turns out it's neutrally stable with this expanded schedule. We'll take that expanded schedule in a state of a neutrally stable strategy as the incumbent in the next round when we reiterate to increase the number of time periods by 1. We'll then assess for whether or not, we'll set that as the new incumbent. We'll then assess whether or not a cooperator invasion can occur. Indeed, it can. The incumbent population doesn't play at this new time period. We add then that invasion to the list of prime numbers. And as you can now see, the process will continue to repeat, whereby a defector population will be able to, or excuse me, a group of defectors playing an expanded concatenated schedule of strategies across all time periods will be able to take over the population ultimately that those cooperators have invaded, reverting us to a situation where we can augment the number of time periods and assess it for cooperator invasions. Note that cooperator invasions always fail at the composite values, but nonetheless succeed whenever we reach a prime number. Sorry, these slides for some reason aren't moving very fast. Oh, okay, excuse me there, and so on. And so for those of you who are able to take a look at the papers, this is rigorously proven in them in a way that would make for a very unattractive presentation. But it yields a result that we can state here, which is that basically whenever we have two or more mutant cooperators that emerge in a population, they can simultaneously invade whenever t is increasing to a prime number value, and they're playing a schedule with a period length equal to that prime number value. And if we were to analyze this model in this relatively contrived manner in perpetuity, what we would find is a ledger that lists all the prime numbers. And so this shows that the prisoner's dilemma model can be utilized as a very inefficient, but nonetheless a prime number identifier, which is perhaps of abstract interest, but does it have any kind of empirical bearing? We'd have to have a more realistic model. And this model, which relies on an infinite population and has this relatively unusual form of analysis whereby we're comparing it at different time points and making assumptions about what the incumbent population would be. This is all stuff that really stretches credibility and requires a more realistic model. So as a result, the next step is to examine what would be a more realistic model that I turn to computational methods in order to deploy. I study a finite population subject to standard evolutionary dynamics, and I disallow the concatenation of strategies because, I'm sure as you all recognize, this concatenation of strategies makes it relatively obvious that you're going to start finding prime numbers. This acts like a sieve, and so you start to identify these prime numbers through this particular strategy. So the question is, if we take those concatenated strategies out of the model, make the model more realistic, are we still going to find some selection for cooperators that are playing at prime numbered values? So the computational model is going to involve a population, a fixed size that ranges from 50 to 200 members. They'll play across a set of discrete time points, just as in this prior model, with a maximum time point of t. The strategies will still be relatively naive in the sense that they will deploy across their schedule a choice in the prisoner's dilemma game that's either naive cooperation or naive defection. There's no conditional behavior or anything like that in the model. The benefits from cooperation are going to be drawn from these range of values here, from 2 to 10 positive integers. There's a no play payoff that's going to take these values, and then I'm going to study the model under two selection dynamics. A pairwise comparison process whereby agents are selected at random from the population, and one of them is the role model, and with some probability based upon the payoffs in encounters, it will adopt the strategy of this other partner that it's been randomly paired with. And then there'll be a birth-death Moran process that'll take place and will also be a source of selection in the model. I'll let the model run for 100,000 generations maximum, and if fixation, that is the population doesn't reach an absorbing state where one strategy takes over, we'll kill that run of the simulation. And it'll restart at the first generation. So these are the contours of the model. Updating also occurs with some randomly varied proportion of the population so that there's no effects that are due to the serial updating of the population based upon a fixed unit of the population being in the stage of updating its strategy each generation. Okay, so here are the results of this model. What you have here on the upper row of slides are runs that ended with cooperators reaching fixation, that is growing to take over the entire population. And then on this lower rung, you have runs in which defectors took over the population. And in each column, you have the runs of the model that appeared under different selection dynamics. What you see immediately when scanning the results that relate to cooperators is that the population evolves to a state of universal cooperation more frequently when cooperators are using a period length, a schedule with a period length that's a prime number. And so in this more realistic model, this slightly more realistic model, you see selection for the types of schedules that we observed in that earlier model, or the types of invasions. But in this instance, cooperation is genuinely evolving. It's evolving to a state where it takes over the population, and we've got, again, a type of revelation of the prime numbers. And this happens because cooperators, it's very similar to the mechanism in that last model, cooperators are evading defectors through a type of assortment process. So here's an individual run of the simulation where I have the different strategies that are available in the model, and those strategies frequency in the population is displayed over the generations in which the model runs. And what you see when you zoom in is that defectors that are playing a schedule with period length 2 immediately succeed by spreading themselves out across a large number of time periods, thus giving themselves a greater chance to exploit the cooperators that might be in the population. But those cooperators that are hiding out at a prime numbered time period, those that are using a schedule with period length 11 in this run of the simulation, they all of a sudden start to skyrocket their proportion of the population because they're evading these defectors that are out there exploiting the other cooperators that are playing at composite value time periods or time periods that are a multiple of 2. And so this assortment process, by using the prime numbers, is helping the cooperators grow their share of the population. Now, if you look at this diagram, though, you might notice that the defectors are also seeming to emerge at prime numbered values, albeit lower prime numbered values, and particularly, of course, like schedules using a period length that's a prime number value of 2. So what's going on here? Well, if we look at another example run of the simulation, what we find is that every once in a while, a group of defectors will identify a pool of cooperators that are in the population hiding out using a prime numbered schedule, or excuse me, a schedule with a period length of a prime numbered value, and that'll allow those defectors to emerge and grow to fixation. And so here's another example run of the population where, again, those defectors that are using a schedule that plays at period length 2, thus are spreading themselves off across a large number of time points, they immediately start to do well, exploiting a bunch of cooperators that are playing at multiples of 2, or playing at time points that are multiples of 2, allowing some cooperators that are hiding out at a time point 5 and its multiples that those defectors aren't located at, and thus providing a basis for a defector that also plays at that same prime numbered period length to ultimately overtake the defectors that are playing at a wider range of time points by exploiting these cooperators that have been hiding out in this location where the initially successful pool of defectors weren't located. So the result here is that when cooperators grow to fixation, they're doing so more frequently at prime time points, implying that they're evolving with a schedule that uses a prime numbered period length. So a result that's consistent with the very abstract model that we initially analyzed in the talk together. But is this true empirically? I mean, this seems like a pretty straightforward prediction, right? I mean, it's like we've got ourselves a relationship between prime numbered time points and cooperation. We should be able to go out and explore some data to see if this holds true. And so given my background in social sciences and studying human behavior, the knee-jerk reaction was to go look for data that comes from a laboratory studying individuals engaged in activities like the one-shot prisoner's dilemma. And indeed, I was able to find a study where the data was generously provided by Simon Gechter and colleagues, in which fit the contours of this computational model that I showed quite well. It was a set of experiments in which one condition of the study followed participants as they made decisions in one-shot public goods games over 27 time periods. Thus giving enough time periods in the investigation for us to dissociate degrees of cooperation at prime numbered versus composite numbered values, kind of providing us enough variation there to explore. The one feature of this which was very interesting in the paper itself, but was perhaps not germane to my investigation, was the way the public goods game was deployed in this set of experiments and in this condition where folks played one-shot public goods games over 27 time periods. It was framed both as an act of contributing to a public good, that is, having an endowment of 20 units, being able to put into a common pool, have that portion that you put in the common pool along with the portion that others put in the common pool multiplied by 0.4, and then distributed equally across group mates. It had this type of public goods game, that condition, as well as one that involved the maintenance of a public good, where folks were not endowed with any monetary units, but had the opportunity to extract 20 units from a public good that already had 80 monetary units in it. Whatever was left over after that extraction occurred by participants was multiplied by 0.4. and then equally distributed amongst the participants. So there was this frame here. In the condition that I studied, the framing had no effect, as you can see in the paper that I circulated, but in advance of the talk. But nonetheless, I mean, this is very interesting. And in the larger experiment that these folks ran, it did have an effect. It was really interesting. This paper is worth reading. It's kind of this, fascinating example of kind of like a fundamental insight on this subject that appeared relatively late after folks were studying the public goods game for decades, and all of a sudden this paper comes along and says, hey, there's this like one way of looking at the public goods game in two ways that actually turns out to matter a lot. So fascinating paper. I'm using the data in order to examine whether or not across these periods we see greater rates of contributions in that public good, effective contributions at the prime number time periods. What I find replicating a regression model that, another advantage of using this existing data is replicating the same model that Gechter and colleagues report in their paper to analyze reciprocity in this experiment, that is the effect of higher contributions at a prior time period, replicating that model but adding an indicator, a binary indicator of whether or not a contribution decision was made in a prime number period. What I find is that the coefficients for the binary indicator signaling that a contribution decision was made in a prime numbered time period is positive, and its 95% confidence interval is to the right of 0 across all of these variants of the model. The model as covariates has the numerical value of the period, thus tracking any trends and contributions across time. It has the average contribution in the prior round by other group mates of an individual making a contribution decision. So a way to control for conditional cooperation, statistically control for conditional cooperation in the model. And then since participants were making multiple decisions in this experiment as they were randomly reshuffled in these rounds, there's random intercepts for the participant and effectively the session, the group of individuals of which that random reshuffling across periods took place. And so across the models, we actually kind of find some evidence that, looks like there are higher rates of cooperation at the prime number time periods. But of course, right, this is like a pretty crude way of looking at this hypothesis because, who knows, this binary indicator could be picking up various trends across the number line over which these games take place. And so to kind address such a spurious effect, I perform a series of placebo tests where I say, well, okay, what would happen if we had numbers like the prime numbers that were the source of this binary indicator, and then I added them to that regression model. So creating a set of placebo primes that look like the distribution of prime numbers across these 27 periods, but aren't the prime numbers themselves. So I take the number line, identify the primes, and I go through a series of placebo tests where I bend this interval, and I create a simulated group of prime numbers, placebo primes, that have the same or have similar features of their distribution across the interval. So for instance, I take a one-bin placebo test, and I count the number of primes across this interval. There's 9 of them. And I say, okay, now I'm going to create all possible sets of 9 composite values in this stretch of the number line. And then I'm going to use those composite values to create a placebo prime number indicator that takes a value of 1 in any period that is equal to the value of that placebo prime. And then I'm going to repeat the regression analysis. And then I'm going to perform another set of placebo tests, that use 2 bins. So I'll look at the frequency distribution of primes when we split the number line up. And then I'm going to create another set of placebo primes using composite values that respect the frequency of primes in those 2 regions of the number line, repeat the regression analysis, and then I'll do this once more with 3 bins. So this is a way to just determine whether or not some of these results are spurious. What I find is in very few instances, when I repeat this regression analysis, in very few instances do we find that the magnitude of the coefficient estimate in these placebo tests is equal to that when we perform the focal regression analysis with the actual prime number values. In about 4 in 1,000 cases do I find a coefficient estimate that's of the same or greater magnitude as that from the focal regression estimate, and which has a 95% confidence interval to the right of 0. I also only find in about a very few number of instances, about roughly around 1%, a positive coefficient that's statistically significant. So this again kind of seems like, wow, there's these placebo tests are showing that this result doesn't have that great a chance of being spurious. That's the initial insight from this model, or excuse me, from these statistical analyses. But one thing you'll note though is that when the placebo tests involve 3 bins, thus the composite values that are placebo primes have the opportunity to be closer to the prime numbered values, we have no instances in which the coefficient is positive. And that's kind of bizarre, right? I mean, you would think that as the values of these placebo primes approximated the prime numbers, you might get positive coefficients, but you actually find the opposite phenomenon. And so when I started to think about that, it became clear that perhaps this is due to some type of a contrast. The numbers that are adjacent to the primes have these lower contributions that's artificially inflating them. And then furthermore, if you think about it, it's like this might mean very well that distance between the primes operates counterintuitively. That actually, as numbers are getting further from the primes in these placebo prime sets, they're actually showing higher rates of contributions in the data. That is, in those periods, you're seeing higher rates of contribution in the data, thus getting this positive coefficient. And so, kind of recognizing this anomaly, I took the Euclidean distance between each set of placebo primes and the prime numbers. That's on the x-axis here, and then I plotted it against the coefficient estimate from the test. And what you find is that there's this pretty clear positive relationship. Kind of realized, I think this result now is perhaps not telling me what I initially thought. Because when you go now and start to explore, what are the values of these placebo primes up here? They take larger values, relatively large values in that stretch of the number line, thus implying that it's lower prime number values that are driving this initial result. And as you take out those lower prime number values, so perform an analysis where the period that's under study is greater than period 2 or greater than period 3, now all of a sudden the magnitude of the coefficient shrinks, and the confidence interval starts to span 0, thus implying that we don't have really strong reason to reject the null hypothesis here that the prime number periods are having higher rates of contribution, and a story that clearly fits with like a conditional cooperation hypothesis. So I would argue that this then kind of suggests that probably amongst humans playing the public goods game, these set of models that I initially showed you don't have much relevance. And we would have to do more work to see if in other data sets that holds true, because here it appears that it's a spurious result, any sort of positive effect of the prime number of periods on contribution decisions. So we nonetheless have, over the course of this talk, evidence of a prisoner's dilemma model that can identify the prime numbers. There's a slightly more realistic version that makes the prediction that we ought to see cooperation at prime number periods, but the empirical data don't find that. So perhaps we need to explore the model, its applicability to other organisms or other scenarios in which folks can engage in cooperative activity. Another possibility, and I'll just leave y'all with this, is that these models also could be used to explore the distribution of primes. That it could be kind of valuable for this computational empirical form of numerical exploration. And that's that initial model that I showed you. If we look at this model of the spatial prisoner's dilemma that has Ulam's spiral as the location, or the prime number values of Ulam's spiral as the location of cooperators initially, we ultimately see a collapse in the population, but it reemerges at particular places in the distribution of prime numbers that can be identified as unique by definition, because they facilitate this form of growth of the population. And so this implies that there's some way perhaps to explore the prime numbers using these tools that I've discussed today. With that, thank you for your time. I look forward to getting your feedback, and if I can take any questions, I'd be delighted.
Thanks so much, Tim. It was really beautiful. Thank you. And we're taking questions from the room first, and then I will look into the chat, and then the online crowd can also ask some questions, which I will be happy to read out. So, Wolfgang?
So thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I was wondering, when you showed that cooperation could appear at the prime numbers, it basically relied upon the defectors not learning anything. So if they learned that kind of the period, say 2 for instance, was stupid in a way, and they should probably shift that period a little bit. So that learning would actually counter this effect, and also just adding random noise might counter that effect, because then they might recognize that there may be other periods that are better to use, because they then match the prime number. So the prime numbers couldn't evade the defectors anymore. And then I'm wondering, the fact that you don't find this in the human data, could it be that some kind of counter evolution has taken place that equips us with the memory to do reciprocal strategies for one. And then, we see many systems where even unsystematic noise helps them to get out of minima in which they are stuck. And even such a noisy process could actually help the defectors get out. So could it be that it's kind of a counter evolution that has been taking place there to actually avoid those prime numbers or prime number cooperation to take over?
The answer is, and this is in part speculatively, yes. I think that there's certainly in a model that would be more sophisticated, that would allow defectors to engage in some type of learning process, you bet. You can imagine that they would be able to find ways to encounter those cooperators that are hiding out at the prime number periods. However, there is an advantage, sort of an asymmetric advantage that defectors have to playing at this wider range of periods, such that you could imagine a population of defectors that gravitates towards those periods where cooperators are playing at prime numbered periods, and that strategy does well, but then all of a sudden it loses the opportunity to exploit cooperators at a wider range of time periods that would be available if it were to, say, use a strategy that was playing a period length that spreads itself across a wider range of time points. So to that extent, I'm not entirely sure, and I would say that in some ways we have evidence of that in let's see here. In these results, themselves, because it suggests that defectors in some ways as a populate, or the pool of defectors in the population has this ability to use the evolutionary process as a learning mechanism. And when it does so, it seems to gravitate back towards these lower valued schedules that are spread across a wider range of time points. Now, it does happen to be that they're at prime numbers, so this type of phenomena that you're observing exists. And were we to add like a cognitive process of learning, one could imagine that it could be accentuated. So yeah, I would agree with you. In terms of adding noise to the model, you bet. This is like a straightforward thing. These are very sort of simplistic versions of the models that are possible to study a first cut, and that's definitely, from the theoretical side of this research agenda, the right way to go. So yeah, thank you, Wolfgang.
Yes, thanks very much. I also was fascinated by this talk and the concepts and the ideas behind it. I did have a question regarding your pilot placebo tests and the approximation of prime numbers. But this is a very top of the head, big picture, bird's eye view question. Can you really approximate prime numbers? I thought that you either have prime numbers or you don't. And then once you don't, there's nothing coming close to them. And isn't that perhaps part of the reason why these models then don't work with the placebo as well?
Yeah, so I appreciate that. And in some ways, in like my heart of hearts, I would like to make that argument. It's that, in some ways the prime numbers are the prime numbers. And so when we run this first set of tests here, this is the real analysis that we need to engage in. And it suggests that the model's predictions actually bear out. The more sort of methodologically conservative approach that I then have to indulge is to say, well, but what if this is just some property of the statistical methods that are being deployed, and an artifact of the fact that the prime numbers are being represented in this model based upon a binary indicator that's taking a certain value when decisions are being made by participants at one period as opposed to another, and that somehow it might be capturing some types of variation across the data in a relatively spurious fashion. This was the best approach I could come up with to think of how to address that type of problem. And it's basically to say, well, we can't have the prime numbers themselves, but we can have numbers that are distributed akin to the primes, that are distributed similar to the primes, at least their frequency distribution. And thus, if we take these frequency distributions, the count of primes across these spans of the interval, that's perhaps the best we can do to address this comment that it might be spurious. So in some ways, I'm trying to resist the temptation to get really excited and say, hey, I found this empirical result that that conforms to the predictions. But indeed, they're not the prime numbers. They're only numbers that are similarly distributed to the primes along this stretch of the number line. Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot. My question is essentially, so if we believe this, what does it tell us something about? So do we learn something about nature or the nature of social behavior, or is this this connection to prime numbers, which strikes me as something kind of deep and fundamental, but could this tell us something about the very artificial way we analyze it in the form of prisoner's dilemmas, for instance? So does it tell us something about the form in which we cast these behaviors, or is it a fact of nature out there? That's
This is a deep question and an insightful one, Hans, so thank you. So I'd say we don't know whether it's going to tell us about the outer world yet. I mean, I think this is going to be the task of performing analyses of the type, the statistical analyses of empirical data of the type that I ended up presenting. And so I can't commit to the idea that it's going to tell us about the world writ large, though I think it could. What I think it does show us is, there's, this abstract insight about the relationship between prisoner's dilemma and prime numbers, so a contribution of the social sciences to this, literature that's exploring ways to identify the prime numbers. But it's also in some ways about using our models of cooperation that exists, say the prisoner's dilemma, and instead of kind of observing behavior of the outer world and then studying the model in relation to that behavior that you've already seen and seeing whether the model can in some ways ex post predict that behavior, so like looking at reciprocity that exists in the outer world and then seeing whether or not there can be a formulation of an evolutionary game theoretic model of the prisoner's dilemma that shows that behavior persisting and being stable. Instead of taking that approach, this is the approach of saying, well, we know these models have some numerical properties, and if we explore the numerical properties at the outset, kind of to understand the implications of the model, then that might develop predictions that we wouldn't have made if we were just looking empirically at the world around us. And so perhaps that's a contribution here, is just to inspire that approach to these types of models. And then certainly I don't think I'm the first person to consider that approach, but I think this is just a good rallying cry to take that approach, is to say, hey, let's take the math seriously, and then that we're using in order to model the world writ large, and see if we can extract some more insight from it, which is common in a wide variety of disciplines. I think all of us in the social sciences ought to do it more. Does that kind of address the question? Okay. No, thanks.
Maybe I have a question related to Wolfgang's one. If I got it right, this is a purely additive model, right? You have these matrices, you add up all the interactions with your neighbors. So I'm a physicist, I have to say. So, and in nature, often things are non-additive. So if you do the total energy of 3 or the total interaction of 3 agents, it's different than just the sum of the pairs. Maybe this can be also regarded as a type of noise. Well, maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, which is certainly my expectation is that these highly contrived models might break down, so to speak, as you add those complexities, in the sense that they won't identify the primes as successfully, because this additive structure creates a sieve-like process, some mechanism already known to identify primes. And thus it's in some ways likely to be reliant upon it. But at the same time, that expectation, even when I first performed these runs of the computational model, I frankly didn't expect to find these results. And so this kind of addition of complexity that seems to approximate reality better in the first instance still led to the detection of the primes. And so it might be that with the addition of this greater degree of complexity, the primes still kind of show through this assortment process. What I would say is that there's clear methods of taking that approach, and I ought to in the future by exploring alternative models of how cooperation might occur. And so even examining a public goods game where now you have multiple agents and there's a wider range of ways one can cooperate, you immediately start to get closer to that type of realistic model that you described. So it's a great suggestion to move forward, and unfortunately I don't have at the present moment enough insight to speak to how it will alter the results aside to speculate as I have. But thank you.
So in your experiments, we would only expect to see the prime numbers if the behavior has some kind of rhythm or some cycles. Is this correct?
Yes. So somehow, and this is again where perhaps the model just has poor applicability to human subjects. Human participants in the research, is that there would be an expectation that somehow folks were using some type of cyclical strategy that in the aggregate would reveal activity at the prime numbers. And so one way in the working paper that I circulated, one way that I considered this possibility also was to, I'll briefly show these additional results, pardon me here as I get through the slides, was to perform some additional runs of the simulation that spanned the 27 time points of the experiment. So that involved a replication of the computational model in the exact same circumstances as the public goods game played by the Gachter participants. That is across 27 time periods. And after generating a large number of runs, I then pulled the strategies that were successful in a given run in the simulation out and created essentially a subject pool of 256 participants that were strategies that evolved in runs of the simulation. And then I simulated their behavior across 27 time periods, kind of like, imagining that they were participants in the experiment and seeing what would it look like if those cyclical behaviors, if an assortment, a random sample of those runs that evolved the fixation were to be pooled together in a sample, like in this experiment, with the exact same number of participants, 256, and then explored their behavior across these time points. And what I found was, I'd say kind of agreement, rough agreement with the empirical data. And so what you have here are the proportion of full contribution decisions in the Gachter data and colleagues experiment across time periods, and then you have these simulated, the proportion of cooperators in these simulated runs of the experiment based on the computational model, and you see that the 95% confidence intervals are overlapping, and so there's rough agreement. So it suggests that, if folks were engaged in some heterogeneous form of cyclical activity, that they might actually kind of roughly approximate the empirical data. But of course, roughly approximate in the sense that the social sciences might buy into this, but I'd say disciplines that are used to having greater acuity in the data, they'd say, well, hold on a second, there's this fluctuation in the simulated data that really isn't observed in the empirical data, and so really all you're doing is capturing the levels, which is true. I mean, this happens to be capturing the fact that there's low rates of cooperation, and it's plausible in that extent that the cyclical behavior is being engaged in. Does that answer the question?
Yes, kind of. So you don't find that you can't really see the cyclical behavior in your experiments?
No, you can see. Yeah, well, and so I guess the thing is that in the empirical data, I guess it's just hard to say. I mean, it's we don't. I mean, you can see that there's variation across time periods, and so that might be the result of some cyclicality, but it's not a clear-cut cyclicality. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't think the empirical data support the models I've shown.
Thanks. Are there any more questions from the room here? Otherwise, I will read you one question from the online chat.
Oh, wonderful, thanks.
This is a question by Wataru Toyokawa, who says, fascinating. This reminds me of the prime number cicada. I was wondering if such a mechanism you showed here would be applicable widely to any other evolutionary phenomena where temporal coordination and assortment with the same phenotype is beneficial.
Okay, so certainly, I mean, one could consider this to be a competing hypothesis with any observation of a type of life cycle that takes a prime numbered value. Although what I would say is that, to my limited knowledge of the cicada and other non-human organisms to which the model could be applied, I don't know if there would be a confluence of prime numbered activity that was cooperative, and thus my suspicion is that it doesn't apply in the instance of for instance the cicada, and whether or not there's other organisms to which this applies, I don't know. I mean, this is due to the limitations of my background in the study of human behavior in the social sciences, but what I could imagine is that folks could use this as a basis for further exploration, because it does suggest that the mechanisms by which you can get these forms of cyclical activity that appear at prime numbered values can take a wider range of behavioral phenotypes than previously known part of this work. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions we have for now. Thanks again, Tim, for the beautiful talk. And thanks to you, everybody, for coming. We have 2 more seminars before the holiday break, so make sure to show up again.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.